You've done this before. The new goal, the new plan, the notebook, maybe a book, maybe an app, maybe a gym membership. It starts well. Week 1, 2, sometimes even 3. Then something happens, or nothing happens, and somehow you end up right back here, staring at the same unfinished list for the 3rd time, or the 5th, or the 10th. And the question that keeps you up at night isn't, what should I do? You know what to do. The question is, why can't I make myself do it? Here's what nobody tells you about starting over at 50. The reason it keeps stalling has nothing to do with motivation, nothing to do with discipline, nothing to do with how badly you want it. The reason is neurological. And until you understand what's actually happening in your brain, not just in theory, but specifically, you will keep fighting the same war the same wrong way. I'm Marcus, and if you're a man who has tried to change, to restart, to build something new, and watched it dissolve by week 3 or 4, this is the mechanism nobody named for you, and that mechanism has a name. Let me validate something first. If you've tried to reinvent yourself after 50, in any area, health, career, relationships, purpose, and it faded out, you are not undisciplined. You are not broken. You are not too set in your ways. You were running a very powerful biological program against yourself, and you didn't know it. That program is called the survival loop. And it is the single most underestimated reason why personal development, midlife transformation, starting over, call it whatever you want, fails specifically for men in their 50s. Not because they're weaker, because they're older. And older means the loop has been running longer. And the longer it runs, the more it looks like just who you are. Here's what the survival loop actually is, and why it was never supposed to stop you. It was supposed to save you. By the time you're 50, your brain has spent 3 decades mapping what safe looks like. Not what's good, not what makes you happy, what's safe, what's survived before. Every job you held, every relationship, every routine, every coping mechanism, every version of a normal Tuesday, all of it has been cataloged by a part of your brain that neuroscientists call the basal ganglia, your subconscious operating system. And here's the critical part. That system doesn't evaluate, is this change good for me? It asks one question only. Is this familiar? If yes, proceed. If no, threat response. This is why willpower fails every time. You are trying to push through a 30-year-old wall with a 3-week supply of motivation. The wall has 30 years of data. You have enthusiasm from a podcast you listened to on Tuesday. That's not a fair fight, and it was never going to be. At 22, your survival loop was thin, short history, few patterns locked in. Change felt uncertain, but not threatening. At 52, 30 years of data. Every risk you took and got hurt. Every change that cost you something. Every time you stepped outside the familiar and it went wrong. All cataloged. All active. All running every time you try to do something new. Your brain isn't punishing you for wanting to change. It's protecting you from what change has historically felt like. The problem is, it can't tell the difference between the change that hurt you at 31 and the change that could save you at 51. To the survival loop, they look identical. Payoff 1. The rubber band effect. Why it always snaps back. Research in habit formation shows that behavioral change attempts fail most predictably at exactly the same point, day 18 to day 23. Not week 1. Week 1 is easy. You have adrenaline. Not week 2. You're still in the honeymoon phase. Day 18 to day 23. Every time. Like clockwork. Why? Because that's precisely when the novelty of the new behavior wears off and the subconscious system recalibrates its threat assessment. In the first 2 weeks, your brain categorizes the new behavior as interesting experiment, low threat. By week 3, the system has enough data to recognize this is not an experiment. This is a real change. And real change triggers the full survival response. This is why so many men in midlife transformation describe the exact same experience. I was doing great. Then suddenly I just stopped. I don't know what happened. What happened is neurologically precise, not random, not weakness, not lack of commitment. Your brain activated its primary self-preservation protocol at exactly the moment your behavior became a credible threat to its established pattern map. The rubber band didn't snap because you let go. It snapped because you pulled it far enough to trigger the elastic memory of 30 years. Payoff 2. The hidden cost of familiar pain. Here's the counterintuitive truth about the survival loop that most men never hear. Your brain is not trying to keep you comfortable. It's trying to keep you alive. And it defines alive as the state most recently associated with survival. Which means, if you have spent 10 years in a career that is draining you, a relationship that is hollow, a routine that feels like moving through concrete, your brain has cataloged that state as survived. Not thriving, not happy, survived. And to your survival loop, survived is the gold standard. Because the alternative, the change, has an unknown outcome. Unknown outcomes are by definition more dangerous than familiar misery. This is why men in their 50s will describe feeling more anxious about a good opportunity than about continuing a bad situation. The bad situation is familiar. Familiar is registered as safe. Safe is the override command. Familiar pain is not a character flaw. It is a neurological preference. And when you understand that, when you stop asking, why don't I want to change, and start asking, what does my brain think change costs, the entire equation shifts. If you're at the 5-minute mark, you're in the small percentage of men who've moved past motivation and into systems thinking. Most men want permission to feel better about failing. You're here because you want to understand the mechanism. That difference is not small. That's the difference between men who stay in the loop and men who learn to interrupt it. The next section is about interruption. Specific, practical, no motivational filler. Here's the shift in thinking that changes everything. You cannot overpower the survival loop with motivation. You cannot out-discipline it. You cannot shame it into submission. The only way to break it is to give it new information. Your survival loop runs on a threat classification system. It asks, is this familiar or unfamiliar? It doesn't ask, is this good or bad for me? So the strategy is not to fight the classification. The strategy is to reclassify. Instead of trying to force your brain to accept an unfamiliar change as safe, you make the change familiar before it happens. Instead of trying to run from the current state, you make the current state unfamiliar. Reclassify it as the threat. Sounds like a small difference. It isn't. It's the entire difference between transformation that stalls and transformation that sticks. Studies on behavioral change in adults over 45 show that motivation-based approaches have a 73% failure rate at the 90-day mark. Not because motivation isn't real, but because motivation is by definition a temporary override of the survival loop. It lasts 2 to 4 weeks. Then the loop reasserts. But approaches that work with the brain's classification system instead of against it, what researchers call identity-consistent microexposure, show completion rates significantly higher at 90 days. Not because they're harder, because they're structured around how the brain actually changes, not how we wish it did.
The methodology is simple. The execution is counterintuitive.
Let me give you the exact framework. If you're still here at the 8-minute mark, I want to say something directly. The fact that you've sat with this analysis, the neuroscience, the mechanism, the pattern, instead of clicking away for a quick fix list, that's a data point. It tells you something about what kind of man is actually watching this. You're not looking for permission to stay where you are. You're looking for an honest map out. The next 3 moves I'm about to give you are not motivational. They're structural. And the most important one is the last one. Move 1. The minimum viable identity shift. The reason you keep over-planning your restart, the big vision, the 90-day roadmap, the detailed system, and then not executing it, is that big plans announce themselves to the survival loop as big threats. The survival loop doesn't fear small, it fears large. So the protocol is, make it so small it doesn't register as a threat. Not start going to the gym 5 days a week. 1 day, 20 minutes, at the same time, same place, for 21 days before adding anything. Not launch a new career by Q4. 1 conversation per week with someone in that field. Nothing more, for 30 days. Not reinvent your entire identity. 1 behavior, 1 small behavior that belongs to the new version of you. Every day, for 3 weeks. The science here is precise. Behaviors repeated at the same time, in the same context, for 21 days begin to register as familiar in the basal ganglia. Once they're familiar, the survival loop stops flagging them as threats. That's how you get past week 3, not with more motivation, with smaller doors. Move 2. Reclassify the cost of staying. Earlier, I said your brain classifies familiar misery as safe. That's not something you can argue it out of, but you can give it new data. Here's a specific exercise, not philosophical, practical. For 7 days, at the end of each day, write down the specific cost of that day's default behavior. Not I wasted time, specific. I spent 90 minutes on a task I could have delegated in week 2 of a new system, and 90 minutes at 52, with the runway I have, costs approximately X. I stayed in a conversation that had no value for another year instead of redirecting it, and that's another 12 months of bandwidth I cannot recover. When you begin to make the cost of the familiar state concrete, with numbers, with time, with specifics, you are feeding new threat data to the survival loop. You are beginning to reclassify stagnation from safe baseline to accumulating risk. The loop responds to data. Give it data. Move 3. Environment as interruption signal. This is the one most men skip, and it's the most mechanistically powerful of the 3. The survival loop is not just triggered by behaviors, it's triggered by environments. The same chair, the same room, the same coffee cup at the same time in the same light. Your brain does not just remember what you did, it remembers where you were when you did it. This is why so many men try to change their behavior without changing their environment, and fail. The environment itself is a retrieval cue for the loop. Walk into the same room, at the same time, with the same contextual signals, and your brain automatically retrieves the habitual pattern associated with that context. The counter protocol. For any new behavior you're building, deliberately introduce at least 1 environmental variable. Different time of day, different physical location, different chair if that's all you have. Small environmental change equals new contextual cue equals new neural retrieval path equals the loop doesn't auto-activate. This sounds almost too simple. It isn't simple. It's mechanistically precise. I want to say something that I think needs to be said clearly, without framing it in a framework. If you spent years believing you were the problem, that you were fundamentally too stubborn, too old, too ingrained to change,
That belief was not a personal insight. It was the survival loop's most effective defense mechanism. The loop protects itself by making you believe you are the loop. This is just who I am, is not self-awareness. It is the loop's final line of defense. And here's what is actually true. The capacity for neurological change, what scientists call neuroplasticity, does not stop at 50. It does not stop at 60. What changes is the mechanism required to access it.
The approaches that worked at 25, brute force motivation, big plans, cold turkey change, stop working at 50, not because you've lost the capacity to change, but because your brain has accumulated enough pattern data to recognize and block those approaches. You need a different key, not a bigger hammer. Here's the thing I want to leave you with. You searched for starting over at 50 for a reason. You're watching this at whatever hour you're watching it for a reason. That reason is not a crisis. It's a signal. The survival loop is powerful, but it has one weakness. It cannot survive sustained, deliberate, correctly structured exposure to new information over time. It was built to protect you, not to imprison you. And here's the permission I want to give you. And I mean this as a statement of biological fact, not motivational rhetoric. You are not too old to update your operating system. You are not too set in your ways. You are not destined to live out the second half of your life running the same patterns that protected you through the first half. What you need is not more willpower, not more motivation, not a bigger plan. You need the right methodology. And the right methodology starts with understanding what you just understood in the last 12 minutes. That's not nothing. That's actually the hardest step. I have a specific question for the comments. Not, what do you want to change? That's too broad. What is the one behavior you've tried to build, at least twice, that always fades out around week 3? Write it below. One behavior. Be specific, because there are men reading those comments right now who have the exact same one. And naming it out loud, even in a comment section, is the first act of giving the survival loop new information about what's on the table. If this framework helped you see your own pattern differently, subscribe. We build tools here for men who are done explaining themselves to systems that were never designed for them. Stay sovereign. If you've recognized the rubber band effect in your own history, type loop in the comments. Not for the metrics, for the man who's going to read those comments at 11 p.m. tonight, wondering if the thing he keeps running into is a personal failure or a pattern with a name. What is the one behavior you've tried to build at least twice that always fades around week 3? Write it below, not for me, but because naming it in public is the first interruption signal you can give your own survival loop.